he is a remarkable character, right? At the end of the day, we do want to see people reach their potential and grow to be the people that they can be, right? You have gifts, use them, right? That's what we're called to, every one of us. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another episode of A Lost Plot, the podcast by storytellers for storytellers so that we can tell better stories ourselves. As always, I'm your host, Maverick, and today we are back with our co-host, Avalon, in doing a review of the 1997 American drama film Good Will Hunting, which was written by Ben Affleck and Matt Damon. So, Avalon, looking at this film, what would you say is some of your favorite things about this film, and maybe some of the drawbacks that you see just looking at it right from the get-go?
For one thing, I appreciate character growth in a movie, any story. This is a movie that's pretty much solely, the story is about a character change, a character growth. So I really appreciate those stories if they're done well. This definitely hits the mark. This movie has phenomenal acting, I'll say. The characters are very well done. And that's some of the key things about this movie. It's also, I don't know, I guess Will's character is also just kind of fun to watch sometimes. Just, he's super smart and he has some very funny comebacks sometimes. I'd say those are the big highlights of the movie. I can't think of very many drawbacks off the top of my head, so yeah, those are the big things for me. So
nice. Yeah, I know that for myself, it's definitely an intriguing storyline. I think that character development is huge, and a lot of movies honestly fall short in the character development space. So the fact that this one is only about that has some huge benefits to it. I don't think it's perfect, as we'll see, but I definitely think that there's a lot to be said for this film, and there's a reason that it really launched Ben Affleck and Matt Damon into the public sphere. It has a lot going for it, so there's a reason for it to be reviewed, and that's why we're doing that today. So, for those of you who aren't familiar with this classic film, Avalon, what is Good Will Hunting about?
So, sorry. The movie is about Will Hunting, who is a janitor, I guess at MIT. He's there for parole reasons, like he got into trouble and he's now working off his parole as a janitor. But he's also very smart, even though he comes from a tough background, he's a very smart individual. And he solves what's supposed to be a challenging math problem for this whole class. He solves it while he's doing his janitor work one day, and that sets off the sequence of events that gets him noticed by the professor and gets him in touch with Robin Williams, the psychologist. And the movie essentially follows them trying to, more or less, they're just evaluating, getting Will to confront who he is. Does he really want to stay the backstreet boy, rough hoodlum character, or does he want to change and become something more? So
yeah, exactly. It's all about who Will Hunting is becoming and different people's voices speaking into that life. So there's a lot to be said about, like we said earlier on, this is all about character development because it all revolves around who he becomes as this young man rising into his own at a young age. So definitely big themes going on. We'll get to that in a bit. Out of the 9 points, before we get into a full analysis of this film, I know that we use that to review films to get an overall rating of how well was the story told. What did you get, just out of curiosity, for this film?
I guess somehow I got the 10 decimals to the right thing again, and with a 1 at the very end of all things. I don't know how that happened.
That's new.
But if you just discount all those extra zeros in one, I have a 6.05. But I would also like to say that in reviewing this movie, when I was going through the 9 points especially, I was just thinking about the questions and thinking about this movie in particular. And I'm not sure the 9-point system, this 9-point rating system, actually fits this movie very well, because the movie, I think, is an excellent movie. If I could, I'd give it more points. Like, it'd probably be closer to more like an 8-point scale in my head.
Wow.
So, like, that's how I would give it if I could. But based on the questions, I had to give it an objective 6.05. So I think this movie doesn't... But that's just my opinion. I think there's... And we could discuss that as we move along, but...
Yeah, no, I definitely think that's a conversation worth having. Just as a side, I actually had very similar to you off of the 9 points, so this gave me a 6.25. So, you know, we're not too far off when it comes to the review. I would actually think that where my rating ended up was accurate. So I'm curious, when you think about the 9-point rating system, and if I had to guess, right? If I had to guess, and your critique is that this is not an action adventure film, right? And this is one, and so you would say that this rating system doesn't necessarily deal with someone who is all about self-exploration. Is that my understanding? Or like where does your critique of the 9 points come in?
Okay, so like for example, this movie doesn't have a very clear villain. Like there is no clear like antagonist per se. Like there are definitely conflicting elements. Like you could definitely point to Sean, the psychologist. You can point to Lambeau, the professor, and you can point to like how they're in like conflict over each other, but they're not evil or like seeking like bad for Will's life. And they each have their own problems, but they're not like inherently opposed to Will. If anything, Will's against both of them. Mm-hmm. And he's also kind of against himself at the same time. Mm-hmm. So while there's all these conflicts going on, like you can't really point to someone in particular in this whole movie and say, oh, they're the bad guy, or they're the antagonist, or they're the force to be reckoned with. I mean, that's one of the things. The second thing about this movie is that, and this is regarding the question on tension. I would say that this movie didn't have like a whole lot of tension per se, like huge tension. Like that would like, it doesn't have like Inception style, like, oh, since, like you're tense at the edge of your seat, like what's going to happen? Like, no, this movie doesn't have that. Now it does keep you engaged. It does keep you invested in what's going on. So it wasn't like, okay, like you're watching and you're not going to walk away, but it's not like, oh, you're like at the edge of your seat. Like, so like, I felt like the question on tension was a little off for this movie. It was like, okay, well, in my rating of this, like for an action movie, yes, this would be important, but not for this movie. I don't know if this movie needs a whole lot of like a huge like edge of your seat tension per se.
Sure. So
there is some tension, but it's not like it's a driving force of the movie.
If I'm understanding correctly, your critiques of this of the system specifically, which if you've been listening to this podcast, you know that we've actually revised the 9 points since it first came out. So it's not like we say this is a perfect system, but our goal with the 9 points collectively is to come up with a system that people can use to effectively critique movies in a way that encourages them to think of what is critical to making a good plot and how to improve those plots so that us as storytellers, as we started off the podcast with every time, can tell better stories ourselves. So this is to get our brains primed so that in a certain sense, even if we don't agree and have the same rating, we at least are thinking through what is the right way to tell the story so that we have better engaged audiences, better engaged people around us listening to us when we are telling our stories to the people around us. So with that outline, fully being willing to revise things as necessary, that's kind of the heart I come to this with during this discussion. So I'm not trying to necessarily just say, oh, I'm right as I come back at Avalon with my critique of what he just said. But the one thing that I think some of those questions I might get answered by you as we have our discussion, because I think I clearly came away with a very different viewpoint of the movie than you did on some of those, just based on that question. So it'll be easier to just explain the film than to go into that discussion right now. But in regards to what you said about heightening tension, there is something to be said about that. When I think of tension, right, I think of the how the film progresses, right? And for you who are unfamiliar with the 9-point system, one thing we're looking at when it comes to films is how is the protagonist of the story faced with insurmountable obstacles over and over again in a way that barricades them from achieving their goal, right? More or less. And the point that he is making is that it doesn't necessarily have to be on the edge of your seat, like Inception level or some action movie level action, to make it still compelling, and perhaps even more compelling than other films that do have that edge of your seat action. Is that a correct or fair interpretation of what you're saying?
Sort of, yeah. I would say, yeah. I don't think all movies have to have the edge of your seat tension. Like, I think you should keep your audience engaged, but it doesn't have to be tense. Like, you don't have to keep them your audience strung out on a line. Like, okay, like waiting for the next fish or next action moment or like what's going to happen. Like, you don't the key like revelation or whatever.
Right, and so fully explaining the 9 points as it's developed over time. Currently, it's not particularly used for romances. It's definitely not used for comedies. We've tried several comedies on it. It hasn't worked super well, to be honest. Romances have worked fine, but I think this is one of the reasons we haven't fully embraced reviewing romances on this podcast, is because there is this sense in which the tension resides in the relationship and how that develops more than anything else in that interpersonal relationship. And I don't know that the 9 points is quite fine-tuned enough to fully encompass that. So maybe a personal growth story, like you're talking about, has something to be said for that. I'm not fully convinced. I think it's close enough. Well, let's just get into the discussion. I mean, I think it's close enough that it still can have a pretty fair analysis of the movie with the 9 points. That's my opinion. And you could convince me otherwise, but maybe if we go into examples, it would be more helpful than to beat around the more philosophical of, oh, does this work in this situation or not? So, anyways, I think the main character is really where it comes down to anyways, because we're talking about Will Hunting, right? And he's really a pivotal character to the story, obviously, because it's all about this boy genius who's trapped in the lower fringes of society, and then he ends up having this one-shot opportunity to be the protege of this award-winning scientist who then wants to give him the opportunity of his dreams and push him on into the future, and the conflict that he has to even achieve that. What did you think of his introduction as a character? What did you think about his development over the story? Yeah, I mean, just go into your thoughts on Will.
I thought it was an interesting, because when you start off with him, you see him, writing things on his mirror, and then we cut to him, his friends pick him up, they go to a rough bar, they, talk smack and, in rough. I forget if they go in to get into that fight at the first. No, they don't. Okay, because he goes to work as a janitor as the college, and they introduce the professor. They show him giving the challenge to his students, saying, "Hey, someone by the end of the semester needs. If they finish this out, they'll be remembered in this hall of records. They'll get all these good things will happen. They'll get this award." Will doesn't know any of this. He just sees the problem on the chalkboard. He brings it home. He more or less brings it home with him. Writes it out on his mirror. And then he comes back, and then he next day, and he fills it out, solves it, and no one sees him do it. So everyone sees the solution. It's like who did this, and no one knows.
Right. Yeah.
And this is only a few days after the challenge is issued, so it's way too soon for in the professor's mind for the problem to be solved. So just the whole opening establishes Will's intelligence, where he's this really smart kid, but at the same time he's also hanging out with the street gang people, the rough and thugs on the street kind of thing.
Right. Yeah, it's very dynamic compared to his actual life and the people who are living at and working at MIT. Very very contrasting.
Mm.
Yeah, I think especially in regards to an opener, it really creates a pretty good dichotomy between his life at home and his life as a janitor, and it creates that boy genius kind of vibe. You get similar things from maybe not to the same degree, but like the same type of mentality with Meet the Robinsons and other films like that, where it's like a boy genius put in a place that he doesn't belong and trying to rise him out of that type situation. Um, yeah, it definitely develops interesting for him because he's the key character, and his development from there is not so much one of conflict with the world, and this maybe answers to one of the questions you had earlier, but I see him developing into a character that everyone is giving him these opportunities, and there's a certain sense in which he doesn't want it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Well, it's
so,
like he has this. Well, yeah, he doesn't want the opportunities, but it's also like he doesn't. In truth, he doesn't actually know what he wants.
mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah,
and that's the other key thing. But he doesn't admit that. He doesn't want to admit that. So,
yeah, and I think that's really key to the story because in regards to him as a protagonist, right, the main character of the story, the real enemy in my mind to this story is himself,
mm-hmm.
because everyone is there throwing him opportunities and he doesn't know what he wants. And this is all a journey of self exploration to a certain degree, where Matt Damon's character Will Hunting is being demanded of by the world to make a decision on what he's going to do with his life. He's too smart to stay at home as a Saudi and work in the construction industry with his friend Chucky when he's got so much life ahead of him with his brilliance. And I mean, Chucky says something to those words to that degree later.
Yeah.
But
Well,
it's his thing that's holding him back, right? Is that he doesn't really see a future for himself in the same way that everyone else does. So there is a sense in which he is his own worst enemy in this film, and the only reason he goes along with it to begin with is because he doesn't have to go to jail.
Yeah. No. Yeah. I mean, as far as a motive, it's a really good motive because it's
Yeah.
like you have to meet with a psychologist every week. You have to meet with the professor twice a week, and it's like otherwise you have to go to jail. It's like
Yeah.
for this crime, and it's like it's a compelling reason. Like, okay, just go ahead, suck up, and do the meetings. And
Yeah. That's interesting. So you say, and maybe this is where I'm getting hung up. You would say that his motive in this story is very compelling. Is that a correct understanding?
yeah, no, I would say that the average person in this case doesn't want to be in prison or in jail per se. So I mean, it's just like, I mean, if you're given the option, or it's like, well, you can have, like, you can retain your something semblance of your life, and you just have to meet with a psychologist and the professor, like, be with this professor twice a week. And let's face it, what is the professor doing? They're exploring math together. They're exploring these ideas, and Will's good at it. And he's like, oh, this is easy. It's like something I can do. I was like, and he actually does, whether he admits it or not, it's something he kind of enjoys doing. So it's like, okay,
Right.
there's no negative there. It's like, just do this. The psychologist think he does have a problem with at first, but not in the same way. It's like he doesn't think he has a problem. Is the problem?
Right.
But he is also kind of having fun, like screwing with the psychologist that he keeps meeting with, and which is irritating to the professor until he meets Sean, who's played by Robin Williams. In which case, that changes turns the tables, and then Will's forced to actually think about some things.
Yeah. Would you so interesting. Would you say that the film really gets going or really takes I don't want to use like film terms because it I think sometimes it's estranges, but would you say that Act 2 starts when he meets with Sean, the psychiatrist? or psychologist? When does Act 2 begin in your mind?
So I would say the second meeting with Sean, the psychologist. Because the first meeting, he kind of does the same thing he does before, where it's like he's trying to piss off the psychologist, as he usually does. But this time, unlike before, instead of, like, the psychologist is like, don't send this young man to me anymore. Sean is like, bring him back here Thursday. 10 sharp. Like, make sure he's here. Like, he's like intent on making sure Will comes back. And then when he meets him, they go to a park, and he essentially does something different than all the other psychologists. He talks to him directly, where he's like, I know you're a genius. That's clear to everyone. But you don't have any life experience. You can't tell me personally what these things are like in person, because you've never actually experienced those things. You've only know these things through books and your own knowledge. So it's like he confronts Will with essentially his youth. Like, the fact that you haven't done anything in life. And that kind of shakes Will at that point in the movie, because that conversation kind of changes things. Because instead of, like, he no longer tries to, like, irritate the psychologist anymore. Now he's, like, suddenly he's engaged with Sean, where it's, like, he's thinking. And he's, like, they start to have these conversations where it's, like, okay, like, almost like this back and forth, like the most intelligent conversations in the movie kind of happen between him and Sean. Like, you see, like, because Sean is also smart too. Maybe not as smart as Will in some ways, but they are smart enough that they can have these deep discussions about certain things. And it gets Will and it has an impact on Will, and Will in turn also has an impact on Sean, because Sean also has some problems. And, like, they both are changed by each other in the course of things. And even the professor, like, he has some problems too, and, like, you slowly start to explore those through all these events as well.
Right. Well, the first thing you note is in their first interaction, right? Where Will gets underneath Sean's skin, and Sean reacts and actually grabs him and basically says, never talk about my wife. And the reaction is remarkable, partially because 95% sure that that's actually illegal for a, psychologist to do to their patient. But there's also a sense in which the reason he gets away with it is because they both have this Southie, like, understanding, more or less, that, like, okay, you just don't rat on the other person, more or less. If you're gonna have a beef with them, you actually take it out on them. You don't, like, rat on them. So, it works because of the understanding that's implied there. But his reaction is very different from any of the other psychologists' reaction. They all just leave the room and then go, don't ever talk to that kid again. And he reacts almost violently in the moment, and then ends up saying, like, I want to talk to him again. So it's completely opposite from what you see with every other psychologist, like you were saying. And we'll get to Sean, I'm sure, in his own right as a character arc for sure. But before we get too far away from Will, that sets him off as a character. So I guess my problem with this film really comes down to these interactions, and maybe you can convince me otherwise. So I'm very open to it. But Will's character, right, is one that doesn't want to be there, like I said earlier. And so I find that his motive for being involved is somewhat bland, in regards to he is there so that he doesn't get thrown in jail. And then after that, his entire motive for being there is to purely satisfy this check mark and be entertained. And I get the impression, anyways, throughout the film, that that's his only motivation up until the key scene later on with Sean, where he has that 180 turn, and Sean really gets to the deep of who Will is. Would you say that that's an unfair assessment of Will as a character?
Well, a little, only because, one thing, the whole prison like threat doesn't actually end till almost the end of the movie. It's not till the final meeting with Sean that Sean says, "Now you like there are no more meetings after this. You like there's no more jail. Like you fulfilled your like terms more or less." Mm-hmm. So it's like the whole movie, that thing is still kind of hanging over him. It's not brought up again, not really, but it's still there. Now I would also argue that Will, I mean, he sees these psychologist meetings as like clearly he doesn't want to be there at first anyway. I mean, he's kind of just checking off a mark and checking off a box more or less, just so he can continue with his life. Mm-hmm. And I guess another thing about Will's character is just like he's kind of just going with the flow of things, like as a character. Mm-hmm. It's like he's smart and intelligent. He's not like making huge decisions for himself. He's like going along with his friends. He's going to work. He's like doing the bare requirements of things. Like he doesn't even like the girl. What's her name? Kristen. In the bar towards the beginning of the movie, he doesn't even...
Skylar, you talking about?
When you come across Skylar for the first time, it's not Will who's, like, hitting on her, like, asking for a date. It's Chucky, his friend, who is. And the only reason she notices him is because Will goes and saves Chucky's butt from the smart college students around him who are, like, trying to make him look stupid. So then he goes in and, like, he in turn makes them look stupid, like, with his own, like, long rhetoric and, like, essentially exposing them. And then he just like walks away. Like he doesn't care. Like he's just doing it standing up for his friend. And then she comes to him right before she leaves and she's like, "Why didn't you come and talk to me? I was waiting for you." Like,
yeah.
But it's just like he doesn't take initiative. He doesn't take action on any of this. He just kind of goes with the flow of things. Like she kind of makes the first move by giving him her number. And
right.
So like if you just look at his character, like he doesn't like he goes to these meetings because he's just going with the flow of things. Like he's just maintaining his semblance of life and freedom just so he can do what he sort of wants. I mean, in a way, what he is as a character is he's kind of this immature kid who's really smart throughout the majority of the movie. And what these opportunities are thrown at him are supposed to do, they're trying to get him to mature. They're trying to get him to make a decision for himself and decide what does he want to do with his life. Like what matters to him. And he doesn't want to at first because it's forcing him to confront things about his past, his backstory, like how he was an orphan, how he doesn't have how he grew up without anyone really there besides his friends on the street. And so it's like he has to deal with all these different conflicting emotions and forces. And he doesn't want to. He just wants to go with the flow of things.
Yeah. No.
Sorry if that was long-winded, but I was just...
No. That's fair. So I'm gonna like throw two examples out for and against what you're saying, and then hopefully we can use that to maybe tackle this a little better, right? And I'll give you my initial thoughts on this film to give you the background of where I'm coming at with this film, right? My initial thoughts of Will is that I think everything around him to a certain degree, so to be perfectly clear, a 6.25 is a great rating. It's not a bad rating at all. It's a movie I would watch again. It's solid, right? It's not in my mind, it's not like an amazing movie, but it's a solid movie. It's like, Casablanca's a solid movie. I'd watch either of those on any given day kind of thing, but it's not perfect. There's things that could be done better. So that's kind of like first off on the rating. If you know that, it's fine. That's not a bad rating. That being said, obviously there's room for improvement. In my opinion, this one is starting from a fundamental flaw. And the fundamental flaw is that you have a disinterested protagonist. And if the protagonist doesn't care about what happens to their life, which is kind of where he's at, then why should we as the audience care, right? That's where I'm coming from with this film. Now, to provide the two contrasts that I'm thinking of, the first thing that comes to mind is my favorite example to bring up on the podcast, right? And we've already reviewed it, so if you want to see the reviews, just go back and watch The Lord of the Rings, because that's what I always talk about, okay? You have a character who goes through character growth. And that character that I'm specifically thinking of is Frodo. And his journey across all of these movies, or these books, is one of perseverance and growing as what it means to be I mean, a lot of it is actually about what it means to be a hobbit or to be a person in the world and contributing to the world. But, like, what it means to persevere, as he stands for perseverance in a large degree in these films. And then that comes to be tested in a lot of ways, and that comes to a head when he comes to Mount Doom, when he ends up giving into the temptation that's in front of him and doesn't continue to persevere at the very end where it matters most. So that ideal, more or less, that he embodies, and that character growth throughout that is pretty significant to his character journey. And I think that it shows, even though, because he has something that he's fighting for, he has something that matters to him, and what he embodies and his character growth in the middle of that can be better fully encapsulated because you have something that he cares about, versus in this movie he does not, right? So that's the first example, right? Now I'm going to take that and I'm going to contradict myself to provide an alternative. And the alternative I'm going to provide is one that is considered a classic in the genre of quote-unquote guy who grows, character growth, man who learned better, whatever you want to call it, type movie. And that is of Ebenezer Scrooge, right? When you're talking about A Christmas Carol, a character who absolutely hates everyone, is an absolute a-hole, no one wants to talk to him, no one wants to be friends with him, and this entire journey is one where he grows and learns to be a better man through not wanting to be involved with the life of those around him at all. So, and I might have to revise that because I'm not 100% sure that's what the story's about. I haven't reviewed it on this podcast, so maybe that's worth doing. But that's the initial interpretation of the film. Those are, I would say in that one, you actually don't have a compelling motive to be involved with the protagonist. In fact, you kind of hate the protagonist because he's kind of a jerk.
Well,
so,
I think, yeah.
Okay, go ahead. No. This is where I'm opening. I want to hear your thoughts because this is kind of the internal battle that's going on in my mind. Like, okay. So does that mean that we need a different discussion point?
So no, I think you're right. He is. I would say he is a little disinterested. Like, he doesn't really want to change. But I can see where you're coming from, saying, okay, maybe disinterested. It does give you a whole lot of reason to empathize with him, to like see him change. But at the same time, I don't. But you just listed Ebenezer Scrooge. I don't. He's also a character you don't empathize with. Like, you don't want. Like, he's not a. He's also kind of disinterested in change as well. I don't think it's an issue of like, do we empathize with him? It's more or less, is he a character we can relate to? I guess maybe, I don't know. Like, I'm just trying to think, like, how relatable is the character? And I think even though like Ebenezer Scrooge, I don't know. Like, I'm not, maybe not. Like with the case of Will Hunting, he's like, even though he is this genius, he's kind of this average guy on the street. Where it's like, you see this guy and a guy all the time. Where it's like, okay, and you even know people like that. It's like, oh, these kind of like rough dudes who like pick fights. They go to bars, drink a lot, and hit on girls, and like talk rough amongst themselves, make jokes. Like, we know people like that. Like, it's a common thing, and we can relate and understand that. So it's like, so he kind of fits like this double mold where it's like, we can kind of relate to him and understand him. It's like, okay, he's this average guy on the street, but he's also this really smart individual where it's like, he's clearly, he's read a lot. He understands things on a level far deeper than what he's letting on. And that makes him more of an intriguing character. Like, just from a certain standpoint, why we follow him isn't because he's like, wants to change. It's because we see in him what the professor and the psychologist see in him. They see a lot of potential. Like, we see someone who could potentially change things and have a great impact on society. Like, he has like a gift that hardly anyone actually has. He's an actual prodigy, but the question is, will he actually take a hold of that and actually try to make a change? And that's the question. And that's what we want to see at the end of the day, is like, what's he going to do with the gifts he has?
Okay, I think I see what you're saying. So to just clarify that for my purposes, you're saying that the main character isn't someone you need to fully agree with their goal. You just need to empathize with them. Is that correct?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it kind of goes back with the whole idea, like, you don't need it to like the main character. Like, you just have to understand them. Like, you just have to, like, relate to them on a certain level. So...
Yeah, and I'm playing another example in my mind as you're having this discussion, and it's of Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, with the main character, Raskolnikov, I believe his name is. Not 100% sure on that, but anyways, the main character, ends up doing a very evil thing near the beginning of the book, excuse me, and from there on out, he's being hunted by the police. And there's a certain sense in which you almost root for the police, but you're also kind of concerned about what happens to the main character, because you empathize with him enough because they bring you down this journey to see how he's gotten to this point. And you don't agree with his decisions, but you do empathize with the situation he's in and how he's gotten there. So... I don't want to leave this discussion because I almost want to come to a conclusion with it, but I also think I need to really, like, think on this, which is because I think this actually has ramifications for how I review movies. So it's not like a simple, like, oh, this is just whatever, you know, we just disagree, right?
We may have to come back to this in a movies worth watching episode.
And maybe it's worth having a whole movies worth watching about character growth, and that could be the place to leave that on, because I do think that he is a remarkable character, right? At the end of the day, we do want to see people reach their potential and grow to be the people that they can be, right? You have gifts, use them, right? That's what we're called to, every one of us. And so this movie is all about growing as an individual, taking on the responsibility of the gifts that you've been given, and then using those. And to a certain degree, you can argue that the ending, whether that subverts that to some degree, I don't know. But, you know, it's like, it's still a great message to be received by the audience. Anyways, so, yeah, I think that probably is a good spot to leave it now. We probably will review it in the future, after I've been given more time to think it through to a greater depth. But yeah, this is what the podcast is all about, right? Having these discussions so that maybe I change my opinion, and it might take 2 weeks of this discussion, but it's worth having. So
that'd be one long podcast.
I know, it's already at, like, what is this, like 40 minutes in, we haven't gotten past the main character, so here we are. Except to a certain degree, to be fair, he's also... And you said this yourself. He is also, in some ways, his own worst enemy, right? It's not like he's facing other enemies. It's more like he's facing angels on his shoulder, each enticing him in a different direction. And there's not even a certain sense in which either of those is a demon, really, because they are kind of speaking good things into his ears. It's just what is right for him specifically. And that's the question of this film. So... I don't know. Do you want to get into Sean? I feel like he's really key to his development anyways, as the psychologist.
Sean is, he is a key character as far as development goes. I'd say also, I mean, if we're going to be honest here, like, the 4 major characters who matter a lot to the story of this movie, it's Will Hunting, obviously, but then you have Sean, the psychologist, Lambeau, the professor, and then you have Skylar, the girlfriend. Like, those, I would say those 4 characters... are, like, the most important characters to the whole plot. 100%. Everyone else is, like, side characters, like, I guess side characters, whereas, like, they do, like, they're still fully developed characters, but they're not as important to the plot in the same way. Right. In the case of Sean, where it's, like, we get this history, we're given, like, brief glimpses of understanding where he's come from, what his life is like. We get that he was married, his wife died, it was a painful, traumatic experience for him. He's teaching classes now. He doesn't do there are certain things he doesn't do anymore. He doesn't he's taking on smaller jobs, more or less. He doesn't do the big jobs he used to do. I think it even hints at his military service in the past, where it's like he used to be he's a vet as well. Right. So it's like he has all this baggage, but he is good at his job. He's a smart psychologist. He's smart. And they bring Will to him, and Will gets under his skin because Will has a similar background to him, and he knows and he just knows how to push Sean's buttons in a way that no one else has in a while. Mm-hmm. And because of that, and I think that's part of the reason why Sean tells him to come back, where he's like, he can see that Will had this effect on him. He's like, bring him back. He doesn't like that. So that he that night he thinks about it and realizes why Sean had this impact on him. And then he comes to peace with that. And it goes forward with having these one-on-one discussions with Will.
Right.
And in the course of the movie, you see this back and forth where Sean opens up and talks about his life, and tries to get Will to open up too. And they have these discussions, and Will has a harder time though opening up about his past because he doesn't want to talk about where he's from and how he was an orphan and all that other stuff. He's more private about it, but but Sean gives him enough information to make Will interested, to make Will want to keep coming back and having these conversations. So,
right. Well, so he understood that
they develop this friendship more or less through the course of these meetings that survives even the end of their agreement.
Right. So. Well, and there was a certain sense in which Sean, as the main psychologist for Will Hunting, understands that he needs to have a deeper relationship with this very closed off young man in order to have the effect he needs, which is to I guess more or less help him through psychological trauma that he's experienced in the past in regards to his orphanage history and things like that. Yeah. So, I definitely think that it's key. What I was especially struck by is how in some ways Sean is almost like the future of a potential Will Hunting future, maybe is where I'm going with it. In that you see that Stellan Skarsgård's character, Gerald Lambeau, talks to Sean later on, and he says, you were always the smarter one, right? You always had all these things going for you, more or less. And at the end of the day, he ends up actually getting the less reputable job, working for a community college rather than Lambeau, who's working for MIT, right? And MIT is super prestigious. So it's a huge contrast, as Lambeau's also won awards for his work and things like that. So it's a wild comparison, and yet Gerald Lambeau admits that Sean is way smarter, and honestly, in some ways, it's remarkable where he's at. But we have this character, Professor Gerald Lambeau, and he is supposedly the smarter one in the group, but he admits himself that he's not, right? He's talks about that even though he's won these accolades, he works at MIT and all of this stuff, Sean is actually the smarter one. He was always a smarter one when they were at college together. But at the same time, Sean is working at a community college, and Lambeau is actually working at MIT. So there's a huge discrepancy between the two characters, and that's reflected in this story. At the same time, Sean says about his own life that he would not trade it, right? He says that everything that he's gone through, especially with his wife, after she dies, right, and everything that happens that his life that is traumatic, he says that the journey was well worth the ride, because everything that he's gone through has been a huge blessing and experience to him, and there's something to be said for that. So,
and in Lambeau's case, another thing to be said about him is he's not only just acknowledging, he acknowledges that both Will and Sean are smarter than him. You also kind of has this envy of them, where it's he wants to be them, because it's his anger at Sean is more or less where it's you didn't. He's just angry at him for not achieving more. It's almost because if I had your ability, I would have done more. And it's with Will, it almost has this living vicariously through someone else, where it's he wants Will to be successful in a way that he could have been. because it fulfills like this innate desire inside of himself. And it's like in that one scene where he like Will burns the work he had written.
You're talking about Lambeau?
Yeah, Lambeau.
Okay, yeah.
But like in the scene where Will burns his like the work he had just created, the answering those mathematic problems, and Lambeau freaks out when he's like, and he tries to rescue it, and it's just like he admits in a broken state where it's like, yes, I am not as smart as you. I can't even begin to do what you could do. Like he is living through Will, where it's like he wants Will to do what he could, like to succeed, because it's what he would have done. So
yeah,
and he feels like if Will doesn't do this, he's throwing away what he has, the gift he has.
No, and I mean, if you talk to older people, they definitely will give you that kind of vibe. Not to the same degree that Lambeau does, but there definitely are older, especially gentlemen that I've had conversations with, where they will, try to imbue their desires for the world they wanted to see on you, so that you can then accomplish that in your life. And it's not necessarily a wrong thing that he desires, because there's a sense in which that Stellan Skarsgård's character, who also I just love Stellan as an actor. Everything I've seen him in is he's just phenomenal. But anyways, as regards to the character, he wants to see him achieve his full potential, and Sean in some ways wants Will to achieve his full potential as well, but he wants it to be Will's active choice to make that decision. And, Gerald Lambeau wants that as well to a certain degree, but he assumes that, of course, he wants to work for the NSA or for a prestigious company that will get him a huge paycheck throughout the years, right? Or something along those lines, because clearly that's what everyone else wants in the world, right? And it's not until Chucky has that conversation with Will where he goes, if you're still working with me in 20 years, you're an idiot. And you're a shameful man because you didn't really live up to your full potential. And everyone knows that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think and that's a huge wake-up call to Will. Like, he knows that he's right. But anyways, I think in regards to Lambeau and Sean Maguire, like, this definitely shows a dichotomy of two people who have in some ways achieved things that they both love and admire about their past lives, but they also see things that are missing in their lives they want Will to achieve. And so those are the voices that are really speaking into his life to drive him forward throughout this story.
Yeah. And then and we haven't talked about Skylar yet, but I mean, and she's kind of like the wrench in all this, that because it's like they have this idea of like Will achieving success, like Will, Lambeau and Sean. But then he meets this girl who's really smart, who's also going to, I guess she's also going to MIT.
No, she's going to Harvard, actually, but yeah. Anyways.
Oh, yeah, she's going to Harvard. But anyways, but she's smart. That's the point. Like, she's also smart. She and Will hit up this relationship. They meet up all the time. She hangs out with his friends. And they grow close. But when she admits to having feelings for him, he kind of shuts her down, where it's like he doesn't want her to get close, where it's like he feels like he needs to be alone, like he needs to put her, like, she shouldn't be this close to him, and so he does what he can to drive her away. And she's already going to what's the college name in California, like she's going to
Stanford.
She's going, she admits that, and she leaves without Will seeing her off. Like, he doesn't even see her at the airport, and she leaves. But the whole relationship, like, you see Will, how he actually does care for her, even though he denies it, because he's scared and he doesn't want to lose any more people. He's afraid of, like, creating connections and then losing them again.
Yeah.
He
has this orphan backstory, right? There's a certain sense in which it feeds into this abandonment background that he's experienced in his life, and he's afraid that it's going to continue to feed into that. And he even says that to a certain degree to her, where he says, you're going to meet this nice kid from, some rich family, and he's going to sweep you off your feet, and you're going to go off with him, and that's going to be your life, is more or less what he assumes for her. And she's like, no, it's not going to be that way. And that's where you have this whole In his mind, he's the orphan nobody that comes from Saudi, and that's all he can think of himself as. And she's the super prestigious woman who's going to Harvard, who's got this great career ahead of her, and she's going to have that rich, successful life, and there's no way he could be a part of that. And so that's where you have that huge blow up in the movie where she says, if you don't want me to call you, right, just say you don't love me and I won't call you. And then he says, I don't love you. And he walks out, right? And it's heartbreaking because he's lying. He's lying. But he's doing it because he doesn't want to go down this path that he's seen in his mind is going to happen, right? In his mind, it's a guarantee. There's no way it's going to work out. And he'd rather just not even try than try and be heartbroken.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and that's like the big, that's the big conflict between him and Skylar. So anyways, you were going to say something.
No, I just was going to say, that's the big, because he mentions Skylar to Sean. And Sean keeps bringing up his past relationship with his wife, who died. And we understand through Sean, laying out his life to Will, that part of the reason he wasn't successful, he didn't achieve the things Lambeau wanted, was because of his wife. He decided to pursue a woman instead, to fall in love with someone and to have a life together. And even though it ended in tragedy, she got sick and died, he doesn't regret it. Even though it's now it has had some traumatic experience on him where now he's taking this small job at a community college and he's kind of checked out a little bit from society, not overtly, but subtly. But other than that, it's he had a great life with his wife, and he chose that over success. And so Will kind of has these two examples put in front of him, where it's this visions of grandeur success from Lambeau, or this quiet life with a woman who can love him and he can love back. Yeah. And that kind of becomes the subtle conflict towards the end of the movie. It's what do you choose? So
right. Well, there's actually a third option, because that's the final bit of the story, is that this whole time Will didn't want to have either of those options. He didn't want to risk it all for the girl, but he also didn't want to have the ambitious life where he makes all this money and a great career. He wanted the life with his buddies, where he was working in the, cement industry, tearing down buildings and whatnot with his buddies while his kids play Little League together, right, with the neighbors next door. And there's a certain sense in which Chucky embodies that life for him, where he is going to be a Saudi, and he's always going to be there, be that guy who's working the blue-collar job, making that wage and doing everything that Will envisioned for his life. And the real breaker is that at the end of the day, that's what Will wanted to settle for. And Chucky tells him, you're an idiot if you settle for this life. And because there's too much that you're putting at stake. There's too much potential in your life that you would waste that. And that's where he has that smack to the face, right? The realization that this third option that he always thought he wanted really isn't right for him. And he has to make a choice for something greater, because that is his responsibility as a man who has been given all of this potential, that he needs to fulfill that potential to do something greater. And that's where he has to truly make a decision. What is he going to do with his life?
I mean, it's not the wrong decision. The third choice is definitely not the wrong decision, because there's nothing wrong with that life, per se. But the whole point of the movie, more or less,
no.
And as far as this is going to themes and ideas of this movie a little bit, it's just the idea of gifts and talents of individuals. We all have different skills and abilities, and the question is, how do you use those gifts and abilities? How are you going to go out into the world and affect change? How are you going to interact with and use what you have? And I think there is something to be said where it's people who have natural gifts to a certain degree should try to achieve with the gifts they have. Like, they shouldn't just let their gifts go to waste if they can. Like, if they tried and failed, that's one thing. But if they didn't try at all, there's something I think all of us kind of see that's inherently sad, where it's like they didn't even try. And that's like, we don't want to see that. We want to see them at least try. Even if they fail, we can at least say they tried. And I think that's the point of this movie, where it's like, and even that's what Chucky's point is, where it's like, you have the ability to go past any of us. You can go and achieve heights that none of us could achieve, like, or even dream of doing. And you just want to settle for this, like what I can do without even trying. It's almost like, because that's the real slap in the face, where it's like, you have something and you should use it. Like, his friends even think that. It's not like they don't agree with his choice to, like, his idea, like, of, oh, I'm gonna stick around here and have kids and, like, do this construction job. Like, his friend, like, slaps him practically and is like, dude, you stick around here 20 years, I'm gonna kill you. It's just like...
Yeah, that's a good line. Yeah. Well, I think that's not all of it, right? You're absolutely right. There's nothing wrong with doing a blue-collar job. There is no unrespectable job at all. You know, I've met people who... I met a lady who loved cleaning toilets, which I had never met before. I thought that was incredible. But that just goes to show there is respectability in any job, right? There is no reason to have a problem with any role. I think the problem with Will's role specifically is that part of the reason that it was wrong for him to stick around was that he was using it as a shield to hide from the demons of his past, right?
Yes.
And so the problem wasn't so much, it is a shame to waste potential, but more important than that is that he was not dealing with his problems fundamentally and trying to figure those out so that he could be a better man. And that is his responsibility as a man, is to face your demons, right? And to acknowledge them, to deal with them, to figure them out, and then to move forward past them with greater understanding. And that is when he faces that, right? When he has that conversation with Sean that tells him, hey, this abandonment that you've experienced in the past and all of these other things was not something you did. It is not your fault that you were abandoned and that you have these orphan experiences. And being okay with that when he was taking that responsibility unnecessarily on himself. That's not something he was supposed to be doing. So, you know, there's other messages in there as well about what it means to face those demons and stuff like that. And that was key to his growth as a character.
I was just listing some of the themes and ideas, but you're right. That is also included in that. Like, I would say this movie is multi-layered as far as themes and ideas. There isn't just one theme and idea. So, and I kind of want to do that in my review, but yeah, that's
Sure. I mean, same, honestly. I had so much that it went through in regards to, like, themes. I'm listing out, 20 different ideas coming through my head because it's so much, and there's a lot to be said for that because it's a great story, and it has a lot of themes going for it. And like I said in my review, even if it stays at its current rating, it's fine. It's an amazing movie. There's nothing to be ashamed of. And I have to say, it was crazy. It's crazy to see Matt Damon and Ben Affleck so young, because so, what are your thoughts on this movie, especially going forward? I mean, clearly it's stuck around for, we're close to 30 years now, right? And it's still acknowledged as an incredible movie, right? Good Will Hunting is known for being an incredible film. What are your thoughts on how it stuck around, the story and messages that it conveys? Are they relevant today?
No, it's absolutely relevant. I would say that, especially in our day and age, like, we're so easy to, with our technology, to sit back and relax, to, like, just take the easy route, just do it set in front of us and, like, not consider, like, what are we good at? What is our interest? Like, what can we do? What can we try? And I think there's something to be said where it's like a story like this can be important, where it's like, why aren't we trying? Why aren't we doing more? And I think there is something to be like, there is something about that message that we need inherently in our society, especially today. So,
yeah. Well, especially in a world that is,
and it's a lasting message too, where it's like that applies to almost any culture and society, where it's like, what can you do? in your situation. Like, there's probably something you can do. What are you trying? What do you like regardless of whether you're from the U.S., Asia, England, Africa, like it still applies. Like, what can you do?
Right, and sometimes it's just looking right in front of you and seeing how you can contribute to the world around you. I mean, especially in a directionless society that we have today, where in America there's a lot of opportunity and no direction on what you ought to do. Sometimes it's just looking around and seeing how you can contribute to the world that you are a part of and the culture and people that you are around. So it's definitely a great message, and it still applies. And I'm sure there'll continue to be great stories that are told around this theme, because it is it's a good theme to have, and it's a good message that all of us need to hear. I mean, even myself, when I'm like, it's not the most amazing movie I've ever seen, but it's still an incredible story, and I was taking things away from it. It's like, that was actually a good reminder for me that, like, I need to use the opportunities around me to their full potential and do what I can to contribute to the people around me. So that's probably a good place to end it. So that's the pod.
That's the pod.
That's all we got. We'll be back as we always are next week. We'll see you then.